Everybody can hear well? I was getting some last-minute pointers there from Kit to get before we get going. I just welcome everybody to the Manchester Community Library. It's really great to see everyone here. I did want to thank Kit and Bill for all their contributions to the presentation this evening. We really put a lot of effort into this. For everybody who was at the March 2nd, I think you'll be surprised. This is a little bit more in depth. I did want to just take a moment before we start to acknowledge a lot of our contributing supporters. And I see in the audience tonight, with your help, we're able to continue our work in preserving the rich past of our valley and the surrounding mountain towns, including Bromley. We have made tremendous strides in the past few years reaching out and sharing with the community, both here in the elementary and middle schools, high schools, and with many generations who have called Manchester home and those who remain here year after year. And we earned it this winter, I can tell you. If you're interested in supporting us, please don't hesitate to stop by and have a chat with me after the event or grab some of our rack cards out there on the laptop bar. You can visit our website, give me a call. You stop downstairs on Friday afternoons between 1 and 3. I can also generally be found in Shaw's on any given afternoon buying groceries, so I see a lot of you there, so don't hesitate. So, thank you. My heart's full of gratitude for all the support we've had for the Historical Society that we're able to share evenings like this with everyone. So, Manchester's always been fortunate to have individuals and families who've donated much of their time and their resources, which have contributed to the landscape and fabric of the community. From earliest days in the 1800s, Joseph Burr, Josiah Burton, the Wickham family, the Pettibones, the Skinners, the Willings, the Arkells, the Taylors, the Shaws, and then we move a little bit longer, and then the Orvises, of course, and starting in the 30s, Fred Pabst Jr. When Fred came to the Manchester area, he and his Skitos Inc. had 6 leases in areas he considered to be strategically located. He chose these areas that were within driving distance of metropolitan areas with the mindset of bringing affordable skiing to the masses, operating on businesses on a chain store model, which could be easily duplicated. He concentrated on the Midwest, East, and parts of Canada, looking for towns which were willing to invest in their winter sports. Manchester, along the summer destination, was looking to attract winter visitors. The Equinox House, which was owned then by Louise S. Orvis, daughter-in-law of Equinox House founder Franklin, had been managing the enterprise since her husband George died suddenly at the Equinox Pond in 1917. Through the 1920s, she continually expanded the offerings, including a complete redesign and expansion of the Equinox Links in 1927, overseen by course architect and renowned golf personality Walter J. Travis. His first co-design was the Aquatic in 1899, and that, along with the opening of the Equinox Airport in late June of 1928, all took place just a year prior to the Wall Street crash in October of 1929, and left Manchester as a summer destination in jeopardy. The summer colony, along with Mrs. Orvis, began struggling during the Depression with the rest of the country and needed to seek a footing as a 4-season resort town. And I just wanted to show, so up here, that's actually Louise. This is the first plane that landed at the Equinox Airport, which is at the end of Airport Road off Richville. Still, the landing strip's still there. In October 1935, the Winter Outing Club was organized at the courthouse and aimed to open 2 ski trails near Deer Knoll on Mount Equinox. They flooded the tennis courts at the Equinox House for a sheltered skating rink and completed a bobsled run on Barnumville Road and began investigating having a snow train come to Manchester. The first season kicked off on January 18, 1936 with a field day, winter carnival, complete with dog sled races, a bonfire near Equinox Pond, followed by a dance at the Burton Gymnasium with the Equinox Orchestra. Ski races were held on the lower slopes of Deer Knoll, and skiers were warned, bravado is not skill. If your skis are out of control, fall by throwing yourself backward and sideways in a relaxed position. And I hiked up to Deer Knoll last week and when I was coming down Trout Lily, and I was trying to imagine, well, where did they ski down through? I wouldn't be me. I guess it would be glade skiing at best. But it was a start. They renamed themselves the Winter Sports Club and planned during the summer of 1936. And this is where Fred came into the picture. 2 more tows were planned that they would invest in. One would be at Mount Aeolus in East Dorset, and that's on today's Frost Farm. And one would be on the Equinox Golf Course, which came up from Battenkill Lane. And I first learned about this from Lorraine Harrington, who told me about it, which her father helped Fred set up the the rope tow in the side yard, and she remembered her mom making cocoa and snacks in the kitchen for all the skiers. The slope was even lighted in the evenings for a while. Lorraine would end up going on to run the nursery and daycare at Bromley later in her life for over 30 years, starting in 1967. When you go over now, there's a house right about here. But I went over and tromped through the woods, seeing if I could find a little bit of evidence from when it was there. But alas, and this photo that we're looking at here was in the collection, came from the Fowlers. And they had it, it was tattered, and it was identified. You can see Fred standing way over here on the far left. He was identified, and Harvey K. Fowler was identified. He was a brother of Joe Fowler and their dad, Paul, whose insurance agency building also housed Fred's business offices on the second floor for many years in the center. He would eventually hang that iconic sign, which you'll see a few slides of that in a little bit. But Joe and his wife, Betsy, would also become close with the Pabst family, both on and off the mountain. Just a little side note, I'd like to talk about Harvey just for a second. He was a 1944 graduate of Burburton Seminary, and in World War II he joined the Marine Corps. They called him the Old Man, actually, in his platoon, and he was killed during the invasion of Guam on July 22nd, 1944 by Japanese mortar fire. He was buried in the Marine Cemetery on Guam, but his parents wanted to have him home, so they brought him home in 1947, and he's buried in the family plot at Delwood Cemetery. And he is the Fowler of the Harned Fowler BFW Post 1641 down here in the depot. So I told you there was a tattered photo. Albert Smith, the Manchester photographer, we actually have his negatives downstairs. So that's why we actually have the exact date, March 8th, 1939. They must have been having some kind of race. You can see they're wearing their bibs. There's Harvey there again. Fred's kind of standing over here in the background. One more shot here. And I don't know if Dave Parsons kind of. So. Mount Aeolus opened up a toe that was 2,500 feet long. Now, if you look at this picture right here, you can see that it doesn't really show too great on this big screen here, but you can see that is one long rope tow. And it was considered to be the third largest one in the U.S. and the longest open slope tow in the U.S. The photo to the left, Dave Parsons stopped in last week, and he brought in a ski patrol belt that was his dad's. And one very efficient piece of equipment, I can tell you. We pulled everything out and looked at it, and that's his mom and dad, and he said, this was taken at Mount Aeolus, and the other pictures I'd had until this one just recently acquired, I was like, God, I don't remember any rocks on the slope, but if you look up here, you can see the rocks and the pines, so I don't know if they were standing over here, but it looks like maybe this one with that tree, so it was nice to make that connection and for Dave to drop off that photo. So by the time these pictures were taken, the J-bar was installed, and they'd cleared out all the large rocks and trees. Then, in 1937 and 38, they had very little snow. So Fred started looking up towards higher elevations. I'm just going to look, and you even consider, they probably saved the photographs for days where it was busy, and you can see there's still not a whole lot going on there. And you can see there's, a nice little crowd. A little bit farther wide out, but still, not a lot of people there. So he looked up towards Peru, and he got a foothold in the area that he would eventually concentrate all his resources. This is the Walker Farm, and this photo was taken in 1931. That eventually would become Bromley. So he ended up setting up a small 800-foot rope tow across the road from the Walker Farm, which he called Little Bromley. And that long Mount Aeolus rope tow that we saw in the previous few slides was relocated to the West Meadow. And it was the only known rope tow to ever turn a corner on the way up. I don't have any photos of it, and I would have to think there were some photos taken of it, considering Fred was a pretty good promoter, but it hasn't surfaced yet. But I'm still holding out hope that that'll come out. So this is a summer shot a few years later. You can see it was painted red by this point. He even called it home for a short time. But during this period, there was another project that was kind of taking shape on the backside of the mountain called the Bromley Run, which Bill's going to tell you a little about.
In the 1930s, there were a number of walk-up and ski-down trails built in New England. There was the Bromley Run, there was the Thunderbolt on Greylock, Hell's Highway on Moosilauke, Sunset Shush on Pico, Nosedive on Mount Mansfield, Chin Clip on Stowe, and Mount Tremblant, and then, as Sean mentioned, Deer Knoll here. And this is what skiing was. You wanted to go skiing, you hiked up and skied down. The Bromley Run started, this is Route 11. You skied in on the long trail, to about midway, and then climbed up to Bromley and skied back down, or you skied the lower trail down to East Dorset. But this one was, due to lack of snow and this long, miserable flat, it wasn't used very much. This was the good part. The lower trail was cut by the Manchester Winter Sports Club in 1935-36, and the upper trail was cut as a WPA project led by Ralph Hutchinson and Walter Beebe and opened up for the 1936 season. My aunt and uncle, Sam and Mamie Ogden, bought an old, it was Oliver LeChance's Roadhouse. He had sold some gas and groceries and stuff. They bought that. This was Route 11. The pond is here. The new Route 11 is over on the other side. And so they bought this, fixed it up, and skiers came in and stayed with them and skied in the long trail and up and down the mountain. Unusual shot inside. It lasted 1 year. It lasted 1 year and burned down in the summer of '38. But this was Mamie Ogden, her younger sister, my mother, and Jean Schweitzer, who I don't know who was. And a picture of my cousin, Monk Ogden, at about, age 5, I guess, and Lou de Schweinitz, who went on to start Johnny Seesaws. And Katie may want to fill in a little more on this. This was, even after Bromley was built, there were still the Bromley Run existed. It just maybe wasn't very well maintained, as the brush notes here. And Katie said her mom was good at organizing outings, so they came over the top and skied down. And here was the crowd that skied on it. This is an undated brochure from Bromley. It talks about train service, so it was pre-53. I'm guessing late 40s. But if you notice, number 10 is the Bromley Run on Bromley's map. Lou de Schweinitz, who I mentioned, went up the road, bought Johnny Seesaws, the old Prohibition and dance hall, fixed it up into the next ski lodge and the one that actually survived. And the other place that people stayed in town was the Bromley House in middle of Peru.
So just a little something to add here about the Bromley House. So by August of 1938, the Equinox filed a petition for bankruptcy. And the corporation was legally dissolved after 85 years under Orvis leadership. Louise herself never recovered from the Depression, and her huge investment in trying to make Manchester into a year-round resort destination. She invested, thousands and thousands of dollars. So by 1947, Jack Ortlieb, who was the owner of the Bromley House in Peru, regularly hired himself out to Fred as a food caterer in the new base lodge there. He had put Louise up for $10 a week, room and board, and Louise held court at the Bromley House, where friends would ply her with her favorite martinis and tell stories well into the night. But Jack and Fred did get together, and they initiated the Louise Orvis Trophy Race to honor their old friend, and for all her investments into trying to make Manchester a winter destination as well. And at one time, the oldest consecutively running race in the U.S. was the Louise Orvis Cup. It became an FIS race? Yes. FIS race. Through the 1970s and has since faded into history. Louise died in 1953, and she's buried with her husband, George, and her son, Franklin, who also died at a young age of 48 in 1951, and they're all in Dellwood Cemetery now.
We've been trying to find photos of the Bromley Run, and occasional pictures show up, and so I guess is that this picture has been variously identified as the top of the West Meadow. And next year I'm going back with a camera and try to figure out if it really is, because I'm pretty sure this is Equinox in the background, and the actual picture looks clearer. And I don't think from the top of West Meadow you can see Equinox. I think you're looking at woods. So I think it's the flat portion of the Bromley Run, but we don't know. But these pictures show up, and at some point we'll find one that very clearly is the Bromley Run. I talked to my cousin who raced it in 1939 as a 13-year-old, and he said there was one age group, everybody, and the trail was about as wide as the room he was talking to me in the time, which was not as wide as this. and you had wooden skis and no hold-down heels and no release bindings, and you pointed downhill and away you went. Anyway, this is a bit of a mystery picture. It may or may not be the top of West Meadow, or it may not be. But in any case, lift riding turned out to be the way of the future, and the Bromley Run grew up into brush, and people skied the other side where you could ride the lift up.
So this next slide, just to come back to a little bit more, this is an early view of Little Bromley, which instead of being pulled to the top of the mountain and skiing down, you started at the top and skied to the bottom. It's kind of an interesting shot. Over here is Glebe Mountain, which eventually would become Magic. This picture will give you a little bit more of an idea. So over here we have, there's the rope tow right there. Well, actually, this is the J-bar at that point. And you can see there's Lord's Prayer here and the road. And they did have the parking lot. And this is a little bit later. This is a Frank Forward postcard. And you can see they had the little shack here and a J-bar set up. And we were talking a little bit before. We're trying to remember when they closed down the Little Bromley. And Stig, you might remember, I think I saw him here, but I think it was when they did the road expansion in the early 80s. I think that was the last of Little Bromley, yeah. Well, here's, as I was mentioning about the Fowler office, this actually photograph was taken by Paul. This is when they were expanding the junction in 1942. You know, the junction was not a new problem. So you can see the pond is empty. So this is taken, you can see that's the Colburn House there, the bookstore today, and they had the Winter Sports Club was on the downstairs. Paul ran the insurance business on this floor, and then upstairs was where Fred had his Manchester offices. And you can see he had a little sign up there, just a little sign between two windows, with the arrow pointing towards Bromley, 6 miles. And then I guess he thought of that a little bit more and said, well, maybe it's more closer to 7 miles. So we made it 7 miles away and made the sign bigger. Not exactly sure how many signs were up there. I think I have about 5 different versions of it. And they were always the same on the north and south. I think they were anyway. But someday I'll do a little timeline once I get enough, and I'll say, I have all the photos. And then somebody will say, no, you don't. You're missing the one from 1967. And now we're going to talk a little bit about transportation.
Roads being cruder back then, vehicles being rougher. It was still a challenge to get here in the winter. And Fred's original attempts, we was having ski areas near cities, and that didn't work out. So Bromley is great, but like so many areas, the mountains aren't quite adjacent to the population centers. And this turned up in our collection. It was a handout on the seats of the first snow train in 1938, left Grand Central close to midnight, showed up at 5 a.m. You could stay in your cars. It was 5 Pullman cars, a coach for those who didn't want to pay for the berth in a Pullman car, and a baggage car for skis. Then they went on to East Dorset. If you were staying at a place in East Dorset, you could stay on, get off in East Dorset. And they came back and picked up everybody at 4:30 on Sunday afternoon. The problem was that this train traffic was really based on through traffic between New York and Montreal. And we just happened to be in the way. So it was convenient departure and terminating times in the 2 endpoints. But you may roll through Manchester either in the middle of the day, which kills your ski day, or in the middle of the night, which makes it rough to ski. So there was a night train and a day train plus some locals. So the ski trains were set up specifically as special trains. I think they must have done some research because it wasn't man-made snow and they didn't always know what conditions were. And I think phone calls were made down to the New York Ski Club and others, and the railroads were ready, and they would say, next weekend we're putting on a ski train. Other times they seem to have simply put on, the southbound train on Sunday afternoon wasn't too bad. It came through Manchester about 3 in the afternoon. So you could get most of a day in of skiing and then still catch the train southbound, and they would put on extra cars. That's what I think is going on here. They're loading on southbound. This, I don't think is a ski train, because if you look at the shadows, it's more like 3 o'clock in the afternoon, not like 5 o'clock in the afternoon winter when it would be dark, and here comes the train. So I think that's the regular southbound Green Mountain Flyer, maybe with some extra cars picking up some skiers. It may have been during the war when there was rationing of gas and rubber. The ski trains carried on for a while. I don't know, based on, this is dated, but based on Friday 11th, it could be 1938, 1944, or 1949. My guess is during the war they weren't running it. Maybe it was right after the first train, or maybe it was more likely 1949. But it gives some times. You were up late, getting on the train in Grand Central, got in at 5 a.m., left at 5, got back at 10:30 at night. If you lived in the city, it was great. If you were out in the suburbs, there was an impetus to drive, and that was what people started doing.
So with the snow trains, actually another area where Fred he put a lot of investment into were ski buses. When trains weren't always economical or they couldn't fill the trains, they started with buses, and the buses actually had a longer tenure than the snow trains did, but they were pretty popular mode for $28 to $33. Your snow bus tours would include meals, rooms, ski instructors on the slopes nearby and to the north. And they were talking about this would have been for both Aeolus and for Bromley. And there were quite a number of these tours, and only some of which were Traps, Babson, and Skiscape store. By the 49-50 season, Greyhound actually picked it up, and Vermont Transits were running special buses direct from Boston. But as you can see, once they got here, getting up the mountain was a whole nother story. So this, you can imagine some of the times when they came up here, because back then still the plows were a little bit, they had to make do with what they had. So in 1942, Fred decided to take the plunge and purchase the lower half of Bromley, if he could get it. At the time, Friday and Harry Walker were the owners. When confronted by Pabst about the possible sale of their property, they were willing to sell, except they had lived their entire lives in Peru and planned on dying there as well. However, if Pabst could find another property in Peru that they would consider suitable, they would swap deeds. As it turned out, Pabst did find a property consisting of a home and 225 acres that the Walkers were very impressed with. So there was an exchange of deeds, and so for $6,000, Pabst ended up with 165 acres, an 18th century farmhouse, and a barn. And that was the beginning of what was termed at the time a mammoth development. So this was the 1 mile long tramway at the bottom. So this was the J-bar that just continued straight up the mountain. But one of the few early photos we have that we have a pretty good idea of where it was placed. Let's see, actually, and now we're actually going to transition a little bit to Miss Chamberlain.
In his younger years, Fred traveled far and wide pursuing his interests in hunting, fishing, and exploring the wilderness areas of the US, Canada, and Europe. He had an endless supply of entertaining stories surrounding these activities. I found Fred to be a rough, tough cream puff and a Renaissance man, rather more than just a ski pioneer. Fred had many interests, including gardening, cooking, collecting recipes, collecting fine wines, buying mail order gifts just in case, and of course, storytelling, telling jokes, and playing pranks. Skiing became Fred's lifelong interest in the 1920s and 30s. He made personal visits to the European countries involved in skiing, Norway in particular, to evaluate their equipment, ski techniques, slopes, and resort facilities. The purpose was to gather information for the feasibility of building ski areas in the United States. A snow sport entrepreneur since the 1930s, he at one time owned a total of 17 ski areas in Canada, the Midwest, and the eastern United States. It might be said that Fred was the first ski conglomerate. In the early 40s, Fred decided to focus all his efforts on one ski area, which he named Big Bromley. It was situated on a sheep farm, as you've seen, owned by the Walker family, with a beautiful southern exposure, ideal for the comfort of his skiers. Fred's invention of the J-bar was a big step from the original rope toes. He installed 2 J-bars in tandem to give skiers access to the top of the mountain, and also brought in lifts from his other ski areas to access more terrain. Along came World War II and gas rationing. Many ski areas across the country closed down during that time, but Fred kept Big Bromley going with a combination of taxis and shuttle buses, serving the train stations in Manchester, Rutland, and Chester. To beat food shortages, he joined nearby Johnny Seesaws in raising 11 cows, 300 chickens, 60 turkeys, 12 steers, and a joint victory garden that supplied 400 quarts of preserves and 300 bushels of potatoes. His father sent him 100 pounds of butter from the family dairy farm in Wisconsin. In 1947-48, Fred committed large resources to clearing trees and removing hundreds of tons of granite from the slopes. The blasting, bulldozing, and hand-picking of rocks on the big wide slopes was followed by a huge planting project to anchor the soil. This was a plan to prevent erosion during spring runoffs. The nation's first manicured skiing had arrived at Bromley. Fred's quote, "Any work we can do to give our skiers more for their money is worthwhile. We'll keep at it until we satisfy them or bust a tendon in the attempt." And as you can see, this was taken from a press book. "Complete consternation overtakes work crew as a girl on a bicycle wheels down newly smoothed pushover. Further work will include liming, fertilizing, and seeding entire trails with oats, redtop, and timothy." And here she is. The Boston Globe reported that you can ski with just a little bit of hoarfrost in the air. This was combined with a unique southern exposure. At the time, one ski writer called Bromley the finest ski area east of Sun Valley. In 1950, the Wild Boar Restaurant and Base Lodge was built. The walls were adorned with heads of bear, caribou, deer, elk, and mountain goats Fred had hunted in Alaska. Many of you will remember his hunting trophies, which adorned the walls of the Base Lodge for many years.
I just wanted to jump in here really quick. This picture, this is a great picture, and it's just something that only came recently to my attention, and you could never do this today. And this is right in front of the Congregational Church. That's the Soldiers' Monument behind there. And you got this sign placed, and I think there's no coincidence that when you were coming north into Manchester that you would have seen this first before you went around the corner and saw the Worthy Inn and the Snow Valley shuttle and the snowman with the arrow pointing up the mountain. So it was great. You could see it would, by this point when this sign was done, it said the Mount Aeolus cable tramway actually was closed. But was that? Ski-Toes Inc. Yeah, Ski-Toes Inc. So it was pre-44. So this is just a great picture that I wanted to share with everybody. Little story here to tell you about this. This is a photo actually that Edwin Bigelow took in 1946. And from all the reading, Fred had a lot of bad experiences dealing with the Forest Service, who we leased land from for the ski area, up here being no exception. And he found it to be a massive amount of red tape, very frustrating to do anything, incredibly difficult, if not impossible. And after years of back and forth, he finally was able to get the government go-ahead for the completion of a new ski lodge on Big Bromley, or ski shelter. And in January 1944, on the day before the grand opening of the long-awaited shelter, it burned to the ground. And Fred was forced to provide warmth and food in his own home, which was located about 30 feet from the base lift. But you can see that happened in 44. And 46, there was still a chimney there about where the base lodge was. It showed up in a few pictures, so it was kind of fun to be able to still see that. So by the time this photo was taken, this is 1946, World War II had ended. And as Kip mentioned, most of his efforts were concentrated here on Big Bromley. Ski-Toes, Inc. and Limited. They were a unique chain store of series of toes and lifts. And actually in 1962, where writer wrote, Fred is in all likelihood the only man who ever owned and operated 17 different ski areas, with all of them going broke at one time. But he persevered. And we wanted to just throw up this little shot here as a prelude to the next section.
During the late 60s, Fred installed snowmaking when it was little more than an experiment, spending $1 million to cover 75% of the ski terrain, the largest in the East. He was one of the earliest advocates of snow grooming with special equipment designed to do the job. This gamble paid off when skiing in the East was a disaster and the snow didn't come. He was one of the first ski area operators to emphasize regular ski reports, which he personally called in daily to radio stations and newspapers. He also installed a fully licensed nursery, the first of its kind at any ski area. These were all important innovations contributing to the popularity of skiing in the early days. And this is Big Bertha. I'm sure many of you remember this. This was a real first.
And that's Kit actually standing in front of it.
Yeah. She pops up all over the place. And here we have Sally Pabst and Betsy Fowler, who started the GIST program in the 50s. The Junior Instructional Ski Program, or GISP, was started by Sally and Betsy. The program brought local school children up to Bromley to learn to ski and become more proficient. The schools closed for half a day once a week throughout the ski season. Parents drove the kids to the ski area, and many of them volunteered as instructors. This was all free of charge. Donated skis, boots, and poles were made available for children whose families could not afford to buy equipment. It was a wildly popular program, and thousands of new skiers were created over the years. Many became employees, and I'm guessing there are a number of people here today that were involved with GISP in one way or another. Please raise your hand if you were. Oh, yeah, quite a few. For all these innovations and more, Fred was inducted into the U.S. National Ski Hall of Fame, class of 1969. Here we have Carl Pfeiffer, Lowell Thomas, and myself. Interestingly, I remember this very well. Lowell Thomas had this funny-looking ski hat on, and I couldn't figure out what that was or where he got it, but years later, when we were in Afghanistan and there was so much in the news, the men of Afghanistan wore that very hat, which he picked up in his travels there over the years. The fall of 1970, Bromley hosted the National Turf Skiing Championship. Bromley's famous smooth slopes seemed the ideal spot for the unique event. This sport went quickly, and in hindsight, it probably was a bit risky. Many of the activities that come next would probably not happen today. And you'll see those. The winter of 1970-71, Peter Palmer and I came up with the idea of a 2-day spring gala and named it the First Annual Old Time Skiing and Jack Jump Revival Derby. And as you can imagine, a treasure trove of ideas spilled out of that title. Here's the itinerary. Saturday, fashion parade featuring classic ski wear from the past. The Bear Trap Classic. Oops. This is this is the freestyle shovel riding competition. And I won second place. Still have the ribbon. Now here we are back to the Bear Trap Classic, a ski race on the Lord's Prayer, only wooden skis, lace boots, and bamboo poles. Here's Bill Badger racing down the slope. A flapjack eating contest, which was had an entry fee of $2.50. It was limited to 20 contestants, no professionals, no man versus food. The Wild Boar Classic was the Jack Jump Revival Derby. It was a giant slalom on the twister, and first prize was a chainsaw and other prizes courtesy of the H.N. Williams store. the oldest family-run country store in Vermont, and currently run by my son-in-law, Billy Brownlee. It's a little ad there for Billy. And here we have Peter Palmer handing over the chainsaw to Ricky Norris. The Torchlight Parade was an annual event. Another memorable event was on Washington's birthday in 1973, the reenactment of George Washington crossing the Delaware, with mountain manager Tut Tuttle floating down the Lower Lord's Prayer, standing in a canoe, holding an American flag. The ending was a bit messy, and we're still hoping that someone has a photo of that. In 1974, the United States Ski Writers Association unanimously selected Fred Pabst to receive the coveted Golden Quill Award at their annual meeting in Aspen. Because Fred was unable to make the trip, I was asked to represent him, which was a great honor. The formal presentation to Fred took place at an invitation-only fall reception at Bromley. The award was in recognition of outstanding skiing achievement. It was a fitting tribute to one of the greatest pioneers in the ski business. Lieutenant Governor Thomas Salmon headed the speakers list, and his praise for Fred's skiing achievements was echoed by fellow ski area owners, ski writers, and broadcasters, as well as industry representatives. Fred had a bad heart for several years. He passed away at home on March 1st, 1977. The ski area closed at 3 p.m. the following Thursday for an outdoor memorial service. It was held on the deck outside the base lodge facing the slopes. It was a beautiful, warm, sunny day. He would have loved this send-off. In 2013, Fred was posthumously inducted into the Vermont Ski Hall of Fame. The night before, the family and friends assembled to recreate Fred's traditional lobster dinner, which included lots of champagne and hilarity. We all dutifully followed FP's instructions on how to properly eat a lobster. Always begin with the legs and the body cavities, he would say. Then move to the claws, and remember, the grand finale is always the tail. Ha 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 ha, that was him laughing. Newscaster Lowell Thomas once summed up Fred Pabst as follows: "Every time you collide with Fred, something unusual happens. He should have been a genial buccaneer astride the deck of a privateer in the days of the Spanish Main. By this, I don't mean that Fred is a pirate, although he would look just about right in a Captain Kidd outfit waving a Jolly Roger. Wherever I go in the next world, I expect to see Fred Pabst running ski lifts and roaring about the lack of snow in hell or in heaven." In his ski area management obituary, publisher David Rowan wrote, "Fred is gone. No longer will the old buzzard be able to greet me with that familiar, 'Come on in, you son of a bitch. Pour yourself a drink.' And how I will miss it."
Thank you, Kit. This came to our collection. It was one of the first pieces with Bromley, and I just always like to say this is when the power of the signature really meant something to have that. So that kind of concludes. We have a whole slew of pictures we're going to put up now. Some of them are identified, some of them aren't. So if you don't see a name up there, and if you happen to know the names of people in some of these pictures coming up, please raise your hand. Any of these that you see that you want to see again, see me after the event. We'll plan a time to get together. There's the multitude of photos and stories. We didn't even touch on Alpine Slide. We didn't touch on, the nursery to the point where I'd like to have. We'll save those for more stories to come. But we wanted to share some of these great photos that are in the collection. Thank you very much, everybody, for coming.